I recently gave a presentation to a whole bunch of therapists, coaches, and advisors who work with and support startup co-founding teams. And as I've reflected on that conversation, it made me realize that co-founder coaching today is basically where couples therapy was in like the 1950s. There's no unified body giving us the research, the standards, or the best practices for how to engage, which leads a lot of practitioners who are all operating in isolation to having a lot of unanswered questions about how to engage and how to best support teams. So to that end, I've compiled a list of 20 different questions and some sub questions thrown in there as well that I'm going to try to answer in a two-part video series. In today's part one, I will answer the first 10, and then I'll make another video with the second 10 questions. And my hope is that by the end of this video, you're going to have a clear clinical lens on some of the hardest individual and relational dynamics that come up when you're working with co-founding teams. Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Jones. I'm a licensed psychologist, and for the last 6 years, I've been working exclusively with startup co-founding teams to help them improve their teamwork, communication, and decision-making. And it is my mission to bring more awareness to this most important business relationship. Let's jump in. So the first question here seems to involve the context of whenever you're working with one individual and the problem is the co-founder relationship. So one of the most common tensions in this work is when a founder presents as an individual client, but the actual source of distress is coming from the relationship. And you as the clinician can see it, and your client might not. And so since you're not working with the team yet, how do you handle that? And so I guess then some additional sub-questions here are, what does this individual support with a relational lens look like in practice? What's the risk of treating the individual symptoms without addressing the relational root cause? And when do you name the co-founder relationship as the problem versus when do you wait? These are all really interesting and valuable questions. My thought here is that if the relationship itself is something that you as an outsider believe is causing distress, it is your ethical responsibility to name that. Now, what I would encourage is bringing a degree of curiosity here. So this doesn't mean you need to say directly, your co-founder relationship is the root cause here. And until you fix that, all of this is going to be true. Now, to be clear, that might happen later on in such kind of a coaching process. But initially, I would have more curiosity like, hey, I'm noticing you're talking quite a bit about how difficult it is for you to fall asleep. And I know that you have been having a lot of these arguments with your co-founder, Joe. I'm curious, like, as you're up at night, are you just kind of replaying those arguments or what's coming up? That's one example. Another example might be, hey, look, I know that you have a lot of anxiety about this upcoming board meeting. I wonder if some of that anxiety has to do with the fact that you and Joe aren't really on the same page right now. Right. So what you're doing is you're bringing curiosity and asking these questions to raise more awareness, connecting symptom to your hypothesized cause. Right. So what you're doing is, you could do those as questions. You could do those as interpretations. So, hey, as we've been talking, I've noticed that as you talk about your frustration with Sarah, that part of that seems to be due to the lack of role clarity between you and Joe about who's supposed to be her, direct manager. And so I wonder if some of that confusion is impacting your communication with Sarah. Again, I'm making this up, but again, that's more of an interpretation, right? So kind of saying a little bit of what you're seeing and then also wondering about it with them. And so that's the type of lens that I'd recommend here. And in terms of like this piece around individual support with a relational lens, I think there can be room to start naming some of the relational dynamics, such as pointing out if you see like a pursuer withdraw type of arrangement, depending on which kind of side of it you're on, I'll pretend that I'm seeing the withdrawer as an example. So I might say, hey, Cole, listen, I noticed that you've been internalizing a lot of this frustration towards Joe again. And it seems like it's been really, draining you and making it more difficult to focus. Like it's eating up a lot of those CPUs in the background. Is that something that you're noticing as well? And so I think you can bring some of that in. You can also bring in, and because, Cole, because you're kind of holding this in, I wonder if that's having an impact on you. So again, trying to point out like, the way that the individual is psychologically functioning. So I'm not using the word withdraw, but I might say, yeah. And does that cause you to pull back a little bit when that happens? Okay, interesting. And so again, I'm trying to bring that person along to increase their awareness and then also show them the relational shifts that are happening. And then, you could, depending on how out there you want to go, you might look for that pattern to show up in the clinical relationship, right? And try to track that parallel process to find out, when are they shutting down in the coaching or in the therapy? Like, what am I as the clinician noticing about how they respond to me in difficult moments? And so you can bring all of that in. And so whenever I think about doing some of this co-founder work one-to-one in a sense, I think that's a great place to start. And I think for some people, this is really, really helpful. It's really containing to have another third party who's helping them talk through the way that they are internally and interpersonally processing with another person. So what I mean is, if I were working with somebody one-to-one and they were not open to co-founder coaching or weren't aware that that's an issue, I'm trying to build their awareness of that. And then I'm also trying to help them understand how they are showing up in relationship. And so that's relationship with me, relationship with their co-founder, and relationship outside. Those patterns all repeat. And there are obviously, nuances that are specific, but I want to help them bring as much awareness to their contribution as possible. I hope that distinction makes sense, because what I don't want is just to reinforce the existing dynamic and give them like a scapegoat, just like kind of, again, colluding with their defense to blame the co-founder if that's happening, or avoid it, right? I don't want to collude with that avoidance either, but I want to shift the attention back to what are you contributing to this dynamic? Question 2. Oh, and this is very much thematically related, right? So it's like, for practitioners who aren't trained in working with systems or couples therapy kind of stuff, there can be a tension between seeing the relational picture clearly and staying within scope on an individual level. And so I guess the question then is, how do you provide individual support with a genuine relational lens without overstepping your scope? And it looks like there's several sub-questions here, like, what's the line between naming a relational pattern and treating the relationship? Specific problems that are always in scope. When do you refer out? Yeah, so look, if I weren't a couples therapist or a co-founder coach, but I was seeing a lot of these issues showing up, I think, again, my focus is on what is this relationship eliciting in my client, and how is my client's internal object relations, their relational dynamics, how are they contributing to dysfunction? How are they eliciting these patterns? And I think that is the golden piece here. If you stay on that side of the fence, fantastic. There is a line though. And so that's the one side. The other one is, I think there are moments where helping them interpret and decipher the way that their co-founder may be responding to them can be useful. So as an example, if I'm working with a co-founding team, let's say co-founder A and B are semi-codependent, they're co-CEOs, and so there's a lot of role overlap, and I'm working with just co-founder A, I might talk about, both his codependence on co-founder B, like the way that he wants and needs him to be more involved, but also feels frustrated with his working style, communication style, that kind of thing. And I might also then, try to provide similarly, not a label as much as a description of what I'm noticing in the other person. So, hey, founder A, I'm noticing that as you describe XYZ process going in up, that's coming up for you, part of the way that co-founder B reacts is this, right? So I notice as you describe expressing your frustration really directly to co-founder B, it seems like that might contribute to him shutting down a little bit and then not being able to follow up on some of those really important items, which leads you to feel even more frustrated, right? So like bringing in some of those observations. So you're starting to help develop and expand a little bit of awareness around the system, the contribution system, as to how these relational dynamics are shaping out. I think that's also in scope and can be really helpful. And I know some coaches who have a very firm line here where they literally say, I will work with you, the CEO, individually, one-on-one. And because I, as this coach who has had your individual perspective, perceive the co-founder relationship to be problematic in its own right, I will refer out. I also see some individuals who want to go from working with just an individual to working with a system. That can be possible, but it is tricky because then you have more history and more inherent alignment with one individual, which can create some asymmetry in the partnership that's experienced both by the other individual whom you have not worked with, and also it does shape your own perception and read of the dynamic. And so even though I think it is possible to do, I mean, certainly with some additional supervision would be useful, but it's possible, but I think sometimes it can be cleaner and more effective for the partnership itself to refer out in that context so that the group can be fully supported by one individual, and then each individual can have their own camps for that individual level support. So I think that's kind of best practice. I think would be optimal, would be to refer out to an effective co-founder coach for that specific specialty, especially if you don't feel comfortable or competent doing that. And even if you do, like I said, there might be some ethical considerations as well. So question 3. This is around educating without diagnosing. So yeah, I'm noticing a cluster of these questions here. So the context is, as we work with teams, one partner might be presenting with what looks like ADHD, anxiety, avoidant attachment, or maybe some narcissism, because that tends to show up a bit. And it's significantly impacting the dynamic. But let's say like there's no formal diagnosis, that person hasn't been assessed by a psychologist, and it's your role to make one. It's not your role to make one. I was like, whoa. So how do you work with that when you're observing without pathologizing? So the question here is, when you're working with a co-founding pair and you can see what it looks like, what looks like an undiagnosed pattern clinically in one partner, how do you educate them about how each other functions without diagnosing? Look, honestly, this is easy. Describe, don't name. You describe, don't label, right? The whole point here is use plain English to articulate what you're seeing and noticing. And I will also be clear, like I worked with a team recently where both of them on like the spectrum of neurodivergence were outliers, let's say. And look, for one of them, yeah, I had a very direct conversation at a certain point individually about that hypothesized diagnosis on my end. I'm also a clinical psychologist, so I can say this kind of thing. But I was like, look, have you thought about ADHD medication? But again, it was out of a curiosity. Like, hey, I'm noticing that you kind of have these, difficulty focusing, and it seems like you're a little bit disorganized and that kind of thing. Have you ever thought about neurodivergence or ADHD? Like, has any of that ever resonated with you? Like, just so curiosity, because I don't know. Have you been diagnosed with it? I think those are fair questions. And then also, yeah, I did kind of eventually make this curiosity about recommendation, because some people are open to that and it could be life-changing and very helpful, and some people are not. And so I do think knowing your role and your kind of domain of expertise, your scope here as a clinician is important. So again, what feels comfortable for me might not be comfortable for you, and vice versa. And so either way, though, what I might focus on is really describing. So I also see teams a lot where, what I don't want to do is add a label that could be unhelpful or ineffective. Because there are moments where you might feel called and pulled in the relationship to collude with someone's defenses by simply reducing the other person's complexity to that of a narcissist, as an example. The problem with that is that label is a bundled term that acts like a gravitational magnet that just pulls in all these other data points. And so sometimes that can be helpful, and because it helps provide containment and, okay, I can exhale. So I knew that's what was happening. Now, how do I manage it? So that can be useful in containing. And it can also be pathologizing. It can also create more difficulty and more entrenched relational dynamics, because it confirms their label, their hypothesis, their way of thinking, which is that Gottman negative sentiment override piece, where that internal narrative creates confirmation bias and really hardens and calcifies their perspective about why the other person's to blame, instead of examining themselves in that relational contribution. So it is tricky, but I really can't say, I don't think there's a one size fits all answer here. I think it is exceptionally context and case dependent. Question 4, introducing the co-founder relationship as the root of the problem. So a recurring pattern across conversations have been that founders present with what looks like burnout, performance problems, or loss of motivation, where the actual driver seems to be the relationship. And so I guess the question is, how do you introduce someone to the idea that their co-founder dynamic might be the root of what they're struggling with when they aren't ready to look at it? And I think that's already what I've been talking about this whole time. So bringing curiosity, etc. I'm not quite sure I need to repeat this. But one addition that I'll add that I didn't earlier is that sometimes, more often, I think people are aware that this is an issue and or don't want to do anything about it. There's avoidance, right? So there's both some resistance to acknowledging it, but also resistance to taking action. So what I really encourage you to do is, this is where you might tap into a little bit of that sales training. You might tap into helping the client better understand the consequences of inaction and how, by stalling, they are contributing to greater dysfunction. And they are not only creating more internalized distress for themselves and adding to that emotional debt that's going to compound in the background, but they're also, in a sense, making a choice that's going to sabotage their ability to fix it. It's going to make it worse. So what I often see is teams who wait far too long to work with a coach. And it could be because of very understandable anxieties about opening up this can of worms and how destabilizing that could be to them individually or to the company as a whole. Not now, Matt, not now. We're fundraising, right? I'm sure you've heard something like that. So that's understandable. And so your job isn't to fix that situation. It's to help them contain the anxiety so they can take decisive action. In this case, I think helping them understand more of the consequences of inaction on them individually, and then as a team, and not just on the personal side, but on the professional side, on the cultural standpoint, all of those factors can help them eventually begin to see that the cost of inaction is far greater than actually taking action. There's a quote by a guy named Jason Gladys, I believe, and I really enjoy this quote. He says, "When you don't engage in interpersonal conflict, you internalize it." And I appreciate that because it's absolutely true. And so there is a cost. And often for founder types who are high performers, who have a high degree of masochistic type tendencies where they can push through distress and keep going and run that marathon over and over again, the default is to put the team on the back and to accumulate this emotional debt. And it's exceptionally challenging because you kind of have this hero complex. You think you can do it all yourself. And you don't acknowledge the real substantive impact it has on your personal well-being and the cost to those around you. And so I think as a coach, it's your job to bring that to their attention. Question 5, clinical signs that burnout is actually a co-founder problem. Boy, these all feel clustered. I'm not doing that. It feels too, so you can't really disentangle it, right? It's like burnout absolutely can be its own sort of function. But of course, burnout in one side of the house will absolutely impact the other. Meaning, if you are personally struggling, your co-founder relationship is going to be worse. And if your co-founder relationship's worse, you're going to be personally struggling. I honestly don't make a huge distinction between the two, and I don't know if it's actually useful. I think these are overlapping phenomena. And so I'm okay with that. Question 6, emotional openness and the business relationship. Okay, yeah. So there's research data that was done that said about 49% of founders are not openly sharing distress with their co-founder. So then the question is whether or not that's like a co-founder selection problem, a relationship design problem, or communication failure, and whether emotional openness is actually predictive of co-founder success. Look, love this. Very, very rich. So again, some of the questions. Fewer than half co-founders are open with the stress they're experiencing. And so does emotional openness make someone a better business partner? Look, I'll tell you, this is complex. If you read Noam Wasserman's book, The Founder's Dilemmas, part of what Noam mentions is that the reason he calls founding with, creating a co-founding team with friends or family, he calls it playing with fire, is precisely because when you have a dual relationship, meaning co-founders and something, co-founders and friend, co-founders and dating, co-founder and family, co-founder and spouse, right? When you have those types of complex relationships, it creates a little bit of a double bind. So in those relationships, people don't give performance feedback as readily, as directly, as effectively, precisely because they're fearful of losing that other relationship. So if you're co-founding with your wife, as an example, because I've worked with lots of co-founders who are married, what I notice, and what most people notice, is that it's difficult to be as direct with that individual as you might a different co-founder, because not only does your work follow you home, especially if you work from home and live with this person, but you don't want to hurt their feelings. You don't want to be as kind of ruthless in that manner. And so that leads to more emotional avoidance, and it's that avoidance that sabotages the relationship from the start. So I think that's probably one piece of some of the reasons why people don't openly share. And then on the other side, sometimes people are following this this sense of this divided mind and body, and they say, hey, look, business has no emotion. Business is just pure reason and thinking. And if that's you, fantastic. But also, most humans are not robots. And if you want to treat it that way, you can just go co-found with your AI of choice. But if you are founding in relationship to another human being, it's going to be important to recognize that containing affect and emotions is a primary function of the co-founding partnership. That reliability, availability, and responsiveness doesn't just take place in romantic partnerships and friendships. That shows up in business relationships too. And so that's kind of the heart of this piece around emotional openness. So do I think emotional openness is predictive of success? I mean, to some extent, yes, but I don't. It feels like a misnomer to focus on emotional openness exclusively. What I think this is really about is, how do we view this co-founder relationship? Is it a source of support, of resilience, of something that we can come back to make sure we're aligned as we continue building? Or is this simply a transaction? If it is the latter, then I don't think emotional openness is necessarily important. But again, this is personality and context dependent. So for some individuals, I don't think that they need that support. And so it can be just a business relationship. A cigar is just a cigar, right? Anti-Freud. And that's fine. However, for most people that I talk to, there is a degree of emotional vulnerability, of security, and attachment that is required and necessary to function at a business level. And so in that sense, some degree of emotional openness or ability to have those types of conversations is beneficial and predictive of success. I also, I don't think that these necessarily grow together in terms of trust. I like to think about trust as having two main factors: operational trust and personal trust. Operational trust is trust in the partner's ability to execute effectively, so at that professional level. And personal trust is, that feeling of, I have their back and they have my back. If I called you in the middle of the night, I trust that you would answer. That kind of a trust. And so I think emotional openness for some people can build trust. And also, if you're working with someone who's unstable, that openness can actually decrease that trust, because you're hearing things that align with your own suspicions and therefore not effective. So I think these are similar but different fundamentally. I think more about if we're talking about building personal trust as connecting with the other human being on a deeper emotional level, which does require some degree of emotional openness, generally speaking, over time. Question 7. Basically, as a co-founder, selection is really important. So co-founder selection is one of the highest stakes decisions an early founder makes, and most of that is informal without structured frameworks. So the question is, how should emotional openness factor into co-founder selection? So again, especially as we talk about co-founder selection, I think it's more important, instead of focusing on emotional openness, to focus on emotional receptivity and how we handle conflict. So do I trust this person, personally and professionally? Do I feel like I can give them effective feedback and challenging feedback? Do I trust that they can receive that feedback and respond in an appropriate, non-defensive manner? And are we collectively able to engage in a frustrating, difficult dialogue and get back on track quickly? Those are some of the things that I think are even more important, perhaps, than exclusively emotional openness. And obviously, that has to be paired with operational and executional excellence. Because if you don't have that, then some of these other pieces also won't matter as much. So I think the way that I encourage teams to do this is not only do I have a process in my book, The Co-Founder Effect, that could be really helpful here, kind of a list of different questions to get to know your co-founder, and in particular, the relational dynamics that are showing up. You can look up the partnership term sheet. That's something in the book that is, I believe, resource 3 that could be beneficial for you. So please check that out. But otherwise, yeah, I think this is something where lived experience trumps everything. So you can ask someone all the questions in the world, but until you're in a state of regression because of the amount of stress and the way that your identity is tied to your company, until you're in that moment, you don't really know how the other person will show up. So you need that experience to really let you know. So I would say engage in a work trial and actually stress test the partnership. And if you do that, you might find out a little bit more about things like emotional openness or defensiveness and those kinds of things that are actually really essential here. Question 8. Why co-founders protect each other from stress and what it costs? Spicy. So one of the more counterintuitive problems in co-founder dynamics is that founders often withhold stress from one another, not out of avoidance, but out of care. The intention is protection. And the result over time is a relationship that has no honest accounting of how either person is actually doing. And this is the mechanism behind emotional debt. That's true. So the question, why do co-founders protect each other from their stress? And what does that protection cost the relationship long term? I feel like, again, I've somewhat covered this. So co-founders, as I was saying with No Mosserman, often do protect one another from stress. And I'm working with a team right now. I'm thinking about two co-founders broadly in AI. And part of what I've noticed is one of them went through a major move. And this is really taxing on him individually. And there has been some hesitancy, at least initially, to bring this up to his co-founder about how this environment he's in now is absolutely not his optimal environment. In fact, he would love to be like rural, middle of nowhere, that kind of thing. And so being in a major city is actually quite taxing and challenging. It doesn't feel like he has a sense of community or, connection with nature, those kinds of things. And so what I've encouraged him to do is to name it more directly, because his response is to hold it in. But also his co-founder is aware that whenever we did like a, in-person offsite and everyone shared their level of energy moving forward, his was the lowest. The co-founders was the lowest out of the entire team, which made the CEO quite anxious. So I say all of that because people will pick up what you are not sharing. So your vibe, your emotions, your ability to execute, people sense that kind of thing. And so if you're off, they're going to know. And so instead of adding to their anxiety, I encourage you to do them a favor and be direct in sharing some of those thoughts and feelings. Because if you avoid it, that does create emotional debt. And emotional debt is a silent killer of all startup companies because it compounds quietly in the background until it overrides your perspective and creates that confirmation bias that really starts to eat away at the foundation of the partnership, because every mistake your partner makes gets chalked up to your inner narrative about what's going on inside their head, your own diagnosis of them. And that becomes toxic. Question 9, supporting a founder who is searching from scarcity. So founders searching for co-founders often do so under significant pressure, time, momentum, investor expectations. And scarcity-driven selection is one of the most reliable predictors of a co-founder mismatch. Practitioners who encounter founders in this position face a genuine question, which is, how do you help someone slow down without dismissing the real urgency they're under? Yeah, this is great. And so what does choosing well actually mean? And what is the right answer to a different structure entirely, like going solo, bringing on an advisor, or hiring a senior operator rather than a co-founder? In this case, as you're working with somebody, I think what's important is, that sense of urgency is real. And I think there's no such thing as an optimal co-founder relationship, or maybe a perfect co-founder relationship. There's only a good enough relationship. All relationships require work and management to maintain. And so I think we can look back and say, certainly some patterns are better than others. There may be some fundamental incompatibilities, whether on kind of how you think about your business, short and long term, what motivates you, what drives you, your why, your motivations for founding, your emotional and financial runway. Like there's some baseline pieces that, if they're not right, are problematic. And then as you go higher up this chain, in terms of how you communicate, how you make decisions, how you divvy up roles and responsibilities, and then even higher up, how you engage in conflict and those relational dynamics, all of those pieces matter too and can contribute to compatibility or incompatibility. But either way, it's highly unlikely that across every single domain of life and business, you're going to be aligned. imago therapists, they say that we object to difference. And that's one of the main reasons couples argue. And the thing that's so fascinating, I'm reading this book by Jessica Benjamin right now, who's a famous psychoanalyst. And what she's talking about is the actual need that we all have to have differences in opinion. And it's actually part of what makes feeling deeply understood so powerful is the mere fact that they are not us. It's the fact that someone is different than us and joining in our world that helps us feel this sense of mutual recognition. And so in co-founding teams, I think part of what's so important is to recognize, hey, there is such thing as rushing this process and not doing due diligence. And there's also a reality to the fact that your idea is important and feels urgent, and there might be market considerations. And so I think what I would advocate more, instead of just choosing the right partner, is choosing to invest in doing meaningful work on this partnership early on. And so the lightest weight version of this is just doing what I call a co-founder date. Co-founder date means setting aside consistent time on your calendar to not just chat with your co-founder operationally, but instead focus on the relational dynamic. So have meta communication, talking about how you are communicating to one another. So you might ask the question, how are we doing? How are we working? How are we communicating? Like, how is this feeling for you? And getting more of that data and feedback can be really helpful, especially if you pair that with doing something together outside of work. Something like going on a walk, exercising, playing video games, music, whatever the case may be, getting a good drink. Something that helps bring you together and reconnect you with one another's shared humanity, I think can be really beneficial. And so when you are looking for a co-founder, keeping all that in mind, setting up a clear foundation early on is really useful. The other thing is, I like to think about this not just from a skill deficit perspective, like how do we have complementary skill sets? So if I am like a really good thinker, but I'm not good at building, yes, it makes sense to get an engineer, but also AI is really shifting this gap. And so I think more about shared resources more than just complementary skill sets. So what resources, networks, capital do I not have access to that a person can help me get more effectively than an AI agent right now? And in that case, I think co-founding with a human makes sense. But if it's more of a skill-based deficit, there may be the opportunity to up level and actually do some more of that yourself. And so that's whenever I think other structures could make sense broadly. All right. Question 10, the last one. Here we go. 30 minutes in. What specific risks whenever a co-founder joins from corporate? This happens all the time. So common co-founding pattern, one founder brings in a second co-founder from a corporate background, and the skill sets look complementary. But what frequently gets missed is how the different psychological contract is being navigated. So then, I guess the question is, what are the specific risks when a co-founder joins from a corporate background, and what breaks down and when? And what are those most common failure patterns? So look, I mean, this does happen frequently as well. And part of what I've seen in my time is I'll give you two different examples to illustrate my thoughts here. With one co-founding team, there was a CEO and then a CTO, and the CTO was more from a corporate background and actually was no longer at this point in his career open to learning new technology. So he relied on PowerPoints, on everything Microsoft, and writing memos, and basically was like, I'm not looking at Slack. That's irrelevant. I don't need to learn Figma, and go on. And it was like astonishing, just both the lack of knowledge of what the current tools are and also the lack of openness and receptivity to learning something new. Because of that, the culture established basically favored the CEO to such an extent that the CTO became obsolete, needed to be exited and then replaced. And it was really that openness to learning that I think was the key cause of failure there. He was convinced his way was the one right way, and he wasn't willing to adapt to the way that everyone else in the company, who, by the way, are all younger, were. And in another example, I just saw another team kind of in a similar position bring in someone from corporate who's taking over, in this case, not as co-founder, but as CMO. And I'm seeing the way that this person is completely open to learning new technology, is actively shipping things immediately, is actively learning AI native tools immediately. And I'm like, wow, this has such a better chance of survival, because I think part of what's different is both the technology that's being used, as well as things like, what ownership actually means and looks like, and the difference between delegating and being a world-class IC. Like, oftentimes those individuals who come from more of a corporate background don't really understand the startup context, nor the speed, nor like that sense of just owning something and shipping it and moving it forward, rather than kind of doing this loop of just constant communication. And so I think those differences are really important to acknowledge and to have really clear expectations set from day one with teams. And so, again, part of what I recommend if you're on the side of coaching here is you don't need to educate them from a top-down perspective and be like, here's the common issues that tend to happen when someone from corporate joins a startup. Rather, ground up, curiosity, noticing, observing, sharing those observations. That's really the meat of the work. And if you're already doing that, you're ahead of the curve. So, as I said, these are all just my perspective. I have this, as you could tell, I have not looked at any of these questions beforehand, other than just kind of reading this document. And so this is one person's take. I would love it if you would share, if you have any thoughts, feelings, reactions, if you do this differently. I would love it for you to drop that into the comments, because I want to hear where you land on some of this as well. So in closing, if any of this was interesting, there's a whole lot more in this book, The Co-Founder Effect. Please check it out on Amazon. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time for part 2.